Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, How to Help Wild Animals Suffering in the Pet Industry. We'll just give it a few minutes for attendees to sign in and join, but appreciate and excited that everybody is coming with us today to hear about how to help wild animals suffering in the pet industry. As you're joining, feel free to let us know in the chat who you are and where you're joining us from. It's always exciting to see the wide range of locations and geographies that people join us from. So there's the chat function down at the bottom. Feel free to use that to chat with us. As I said, we'll get started in just about a minute. We'll give a little more time for people to sign on and sign in. Thank you so much. I appreciate your patience. Okay, there's potentially a small issue with the chat function, so we'll hopefully get that sorted out. In the meantime, we will go ahead and get started so that we can get on to the topic at hand, but looks like we've got a good number of people joining us today. Hopefully we'll get the chat feature sorted out soon, but there is also the Q&A function, which you can use to ask any questions as well. So that is another option. Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is How to Help Wild Animals Suffering in the Pet Industry. I'm Cameron Harsh. I am the Director of Programs for World Animal Protection US. I just really appreciate you all joining us today and giving us some of your time to hear from our speakers about the animals that are suffering in the wildlife trade for use as pets in human homes. Small wild animals are bred in cruel commercial breeding operations, also called mills, and sold in big box pet stores every day. In their more than 3,000 stores across the US, Canada, and Mexico, PetSmart and Petco sell wild animals such as parakeets, turtles, bearded dragons, and snakes. And all of these animals experience some degree of suffering along the way. Today, you'll learn just how the pet store industry hurts these wild animals, how to get involved in our campaigns, pushing both PetSmart and Petco to end animal sales, and also learn how to sign up for an exciting opportunity to deliver our campaign packet to PetSmart for National Reptile Awareness Day. Next slide. Before we dive into it, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you to World Animal Protection. If you're not yet familiar with us, we are a global animal welfare protection organization with offices in 12 different countries around the world. We focus on protecting animals in the wild and animals in farming. Next slide. Our mission is to move the world to protect animals. And our vision is a world where animals live free from suffering. So I'm really excited, next slide please, that joining us today are Liz Cabrera-Holtz, the Wildlife Campaign Manager for World Animal Protection in the US, focused on the pets issue, and Michelle Hammers, Wildlife Campaign Manager for World Animal Protection Canada, focused on this issue. There will be time at the end for a brief Q&A with both Liz and Michelle, but as the speakers present, as questions come to mind, please feel free to add them into the Q&A function, and we'll be compiling those and be using those for the Q&A feature at the end. So next slide. Great, I will now turn it over to Liz Cabrera-Holtz to launch the webinar officially for you all.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Cameron. So as Cameron said, today we're going to talk about how the pet industry, specifically PetSmart and Petco, hurts wild animals and, of course, non-wild animals. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on the mills that these animals are bred in, as well as the tension between PetSmart and Petco's charitable arms and their continued sale of animals. And my colleague Michelle is going to talk about the wildlife trade and the impact of captivity on the well-being of these smaller wild animals. Now, if you joined us last spring for our webinar about the impact of animal sales on shelters and sanctuaries, thank you so much for joining us again today. And don't worry, today's session will be different because we're going to go a bit more in depth on a few topics, and it's going to be action-oriented. So we would love to find people who want to get involved at whatever level in our ongoing campaigns, urging PetSmart and Petco to phase out animal sales. So let's dive in. On your screen, you'll see an overview of the major problems with selling wild animals in stores. They come from large-scale, low-welfare breeding operations called mills. They often end up in animal shelters already struggling to care for the dogs and cats in their community. It jeopardizes public health, negatively impacts biodiversity, and of course, these wild animals, when they're being purchased as pets, they're being condemned to a lifetime in a human home. And on the other side of your screen, you'll see just some of the wild animal species sold at PetSmart and Petco, from red-eared sliders to Russian tortoises to parakeets. Both of these stores sell a large variety of wild animals whose homes in the wild are generally not even in the United States. And this is in addition to the small mammals they sell like hamsters, guinea pigs, and mice. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, reptile and other wild animal sales are growing, and one of the big drivers of this growth is the retail pet industry. Research from the American Veterinary Medical Association found that the #1 source of reptiles, birds, and fish are pet stores. And PetSmart and Petco make up the majority of the retail pet industry in North America. Together, they have more than 3,000 stores, and you can see comparatively in your screen in this chart that the next biggest chains only have a fraction of these locations. Now, one of the reasons, or the main reason, that PetSmart and Petco are so keen to push these wild animal sales is because selling the supplies they need is really profitable. Many reptiles and other small wild animals are what's known as loss leaders in the pet industry, meaning pet stores generally don't profit from the actual sale of the animal. What they're profiting from is the equipment, the food, the supplies that people subsequently need to maintain the animal in a human home. Because, of course, a bearded dragon is not the same as a puppy. To keep a bearded dragon in your house, you need special equipment, special lights, UV lights, just to keep her alive. Next slide, please. The vast majority of animals, wild or not, sold in stores come from these cruel commercial breeding facilities called mills. And additionally, wild animals may be supplied by companies that import animals from foreign mills, so similar mills in other countries, or actually take them from the wild. And similar to puppy mills, reptile, bird, and small mammal mills produce as many animals as quickly as possible without regard for their well-being. And dead animals are just seen as the cost of doing business. And in mills, generally, animals aren't provided veterinary care, injuries and illnesses are ignored, or the animals are just killed, sometimes through methods like gassing or being frozen in a freezer. Animals are forced to fight for limited food and water. It's dirty, there's no space. It's just a miserable place to be. And we recently launched a microsite that walks you through some of the biggest problems with the retail pet industry. And one of the sections uses illustrations and a little story to tell the story of Bee, a bearded dragon who is born in a reptile mill and then sold in a pet store. And though Bee's story is fictional, the suffering of all the wild animals she represents is not. And you can check out the site using the link in the chat. Next slide, please. So now on your screen, you'll see some news reports about undercover investigations and federal government investigations of mills that supply or have supplied Petco and PetSmart. So the US Department of Agriculture, a federal agency, regulates very badly, but it does regulate some animal mills, though currently they don't regulate bird and reptile mills. And they file inspection reports. So these government officials go out and inspect the facility, and they file inspection reports that are available online, which in some of these inspection reports have revealed really disturbing conditions. In the bottom left, you'll see a real inspection report of Sun Pets, which is a Petco and PetSmart supplier, that notes a sick rabbit as well as cannibalization among hamsters. You'll also see an article, the top left, from the Daily Beast about a Pennsylvania mill called Holmes Farms, which supplied Petco, PetSmart, and Pet Supplies Plus, which is another significant chain. And at this mill, they froze and gassed small animals to death. And it's important to know this is going on at all these mills, but these are some mills that have come under fire that their cruelty has been exposed to the public. And eventually the Montgomery County DA filed animal cruelty charges against the owner of Holmes Farm, and he ultimately pled guilty. For a mill to be prosecuted is really, really unusual and underscores just how bad the conditions were and how helpful media exposure was in that case. Some of these suppliers have existed for decades. They've been plagued with the same problems, but nothing is changing. Next slide, please. So at the same time that PetSmart and Petco are selling these animals, they're also running large charities that promote adoption, primarily for dogs and cats, but other animals as well. For example, Petco frequently touts its support of Petco Love, its nonprofit arm, and how many animals they've saved from euthanasia every year. But animal sales, any animal sales, mean more animals are going to end up in shelters. And by marketing wild animals like birds and turtles as easy to keep or beginner animals, the company sends the message that these animals require minimal care and are even appropriate for children. Then the purchasers who aren't prepared for the time and money these animals actually require take them to shelters, which in turn struggle to find homes and have to divert resources from helping dogs and cats. So you'll see on one side of your screen several articles about shelters being completely overwhelmed with these smaller wild animals or other small mammals that these stores sell. The New York Times just ran a big feature about animals like geckos and guinea pigs who were purchased at pet stores during the pandemic and are now flooding shelters. And below there's another article about the biggest shelter in Philadelphia that's struggling with an influx of wild animals. On the other side, you'll see articles and promotional materials from PetSmart and Petco touting their adoptions and how they help shelters. And I think the hypocrisy speaks for itself. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Michelle.
Thanks, Liz. Very excited to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I work in the Canadian office out of Toronto. And similar to Liz, we also have a campaign against PetSmart. It's a coordinated campaign. And today I'll be talking a bit about the difference between wild and domesticated animals and the animal welfare impacts that captivity has on these smaller animals that people might not think about when they walk into a Petco or PetSmart store. Next slide, please. So to begin, explaining wild versus domesticated, and you might already be familiar with it, starting with our domesticated pets, like our dogs and cats. These animals have been bred for thousands of years, and they have been bred for very specific traits that allow them to live better alongside humans. Which is very different than the animals, the wild animals you might see in the pet stores or come across online, which are animals that haven't been bred for such a long time. And more importantly, they haven't undergone the genetic change in their appearance and or behavior. So whereas a dog is clearly different than the wild counterparts, the wolves, when you look at a snake, they might have a different color, might have a different skill pattern, but behaviorally speaking, they are exactly the same as the snakes you would find in the wild. And this is a very important differentiation because these wild animals haven't evolved to live with us. They haven't evolved to live in a captive setting. And that's the biggest problem. So captivity inherently limits their behaviors, which cause welfare problems and suffering. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the wildlife trade in more general, kind of zooming out here. This applies to Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry where thousands of individual species are traded, and it affects millions, even billions of individual animals. And the exotic pet industry or the stores that sell these wild animals are complicit in that, right? They contribute to this trade. The trade can be legal and illegal. It is very hard to separate the two. An animal might be traded or come from a country where they were captured illegally, but then as soon as they're on the market here in North America, they are sold legally. So it's the regulations are very convoluted and it's hard to regulate it with the regulations that currently exist. It's one of the key drivers of the wildlife trade. As you might know, we're in a biodiversity crisis. A lot of wild animals are losing their habitat, but a lot of wild animals continue to be caught from the wild and put into the pet trade for our entertainment and therefore the pet trade itself is complicit to the decrease of biodiversity. So what are the risks? And Liz talked a bit about this as well. There's animal health and welfare risk, which I dive in a little bit later. Human health and safety. Reptiles can be carriers of diseases. Other small animals, birds, can be carriers of diseases and can infect us without becoming sick themselves. So if you go to the CDC in the US, you will find numerous cases of wild animals being kept as pet that have caused some sort of outbreak, affecting people and sometimes even causing death, unfortunately. Other things are ecological disruption. As we mentioned, legal trade fuels the illegal trade. And there's also a very important issue about invasiveness, because often these animals, because they are put on the market in such great numbers, if they're not wanted anymore, they have nowhere to go. Shelters are overfull. A lot of shelters might not even take in these animals because they're very different than dogs and cats, and that can lead to animals being disposed of in the wild, where they might eventually be able to survive and outcompete our native wildlife, which is an enormous issue. And a lot of money is being spent to then eradicate these animals, which in itself is also an animal welfare issue. So lots of things connect, and lots of reasons for the companies to really stop contributing to this trade. Next slide, please. So when we look at wild animal welfare husbandry, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. So if you ever walk into a store and you look at these spaces, it might be hard to think about, like, okay, what am I seeing and how should it be, right? With a dog and a cat, we kind of know dog needs to be walked, cat needs to have something to play with. So we kind of understand what these animals need. When it comes to wild animals, it's much more complicated because, again, they haven't evolved to live with us. So one of the things that all animals need is space. And we might think, and I'll talk a bit about that later, well, this animal doesn't move a lot or is very small, so therefore they don't need space. But if we look in the wild and how they behave and how they use their habitat, animals are very active. So without space, you can't create an active lifestyle for these animals. And therefore, captivity in itself is always kind of an issue, because in a living room, it's very hard to provide any space, right? Environment and climate is important, especially when we're talking about these cold-blooded animals, as we call them, like amphibians, like reptiles. They are reliant of sunlight, of certain temperature ranges, which is very difficult, if not impossible, to reproduce in captivity. They have very specific diets. Often we don't even know what kind of diet they need. And we're finding out new things, like, some of these animals are really social, which is something that we never knew before. So overall, the problem is often with these wild animals is that they're very poorly studied in the wild. And therefore, in captivity, we actually don't know what they need. And it causes just a lot of suffering and high mortality rates from the moment that they are born at a mill, to the moment that they are in a store, to the moment that they are in people's houses. Overall, like we do with our cats and dogs, and if you would go to or interact with any other animal, it's very important to them that they can engage in natural behaviors and that they can make choices, that they have control over their own life. You can even think about yourself, right? Like you want to make sure that you have some decision making in your own life, some agency, and this is completely the same thing for animals. So some of the challenges keeping wild animals in captivity, as I mentioned, captivity inherently limits their possibility to engage in natural behavior. So there's always some dimension of suffering that is going on because they can't fulfill their needs completely. One other thing, especially when it comes to wild animals being kept as pets, is recognizing behaviors that are indicators of poor welfare. So because these animals, they might not vocalize, they might not have expressions on their faces, it might be very difficult to realize, hey, this animal is ill or this animal is not engaging in natural behaviors. And you need to be kind of trained for that, especially when it comes to birds, reptiles, amphibians, like the smaller animals that we might skip over often. It's hard to recognize what's going on with these animals, especially in a captive setting. Next slide, please. So just to show you some examples about how we, or how the keeping of these animals has been normalized in captivity versus where they're actually coming from. So on the left is a picture of a habitat in Africa, in Western Africa, where ball pythons live. Ball pythons are snakes that are very popular in the pet industry. They breed easily, for example, and they come in all colors, and you know, they are the pet industry promotes them as easy to be, that they can be easily kept. But if you look at the complexity of the picture on the left, right, like the leaves and the sand and everything else, versus how this animal is being sold, and this picture was taken at a PetSmart store, and you can see there is no resemblance between the wild habitat of the species versus how this animal is presented in a captive setting. So you can imagine when people buy an animal like this, that for them to realize like, oh, they need much more. People don't know. We did a study in Canada, and I think 30% of people don't even do any research when it comes to buying these animals. So this is a big problem for the animal because their life is limited to this tank, this small setting. Next slide, please. So two more examples, same idea behind it. On the right side, you can see a bearded dragon. They're lizards from Australia. They move a lot. They are very busy animals that are very active. And as you can see, these animals are being sold in a way this was at a reptile market, where none of their natural behaviors is acknowledged, or where the animal is able to participate or engage in their natural behaviors. And on the left, you see the natural habitat, which is impossible to replicate in captivity. And then I have one more example. Next slide, please. And these are turtles. And the same idea. On the right side, you see how turtle tank has been promoted by the pet industry, whereas on the left side, you see a picture of that particular turtle. I think they might be red ear sliders, and how they live in their native habitat with, like, you know, different plants and different areas to bathe in the sun or to be in the water. And as you can see, a tank can never replicate what these animals have in the wild. And that's one of the reasons that these animals should not be kept as pets. Next slide, please. So how has this happened? Why do we have normalized this kind of keeping of these animals in this way? Well, truth is, the husbandry that is deemed to be acceptable in the industry is based around trial and error. So what happened historically is that animals were taken from the wild, put into captivity, and then people tried to keep them alive. An animal would die and then would be replaced. And then the next time, the animal might have lived a year longer, and then a year longer. So that's the way that these kind of like husbandry principles have evolved, is basically to be able to keep the animal alive. But as you might know, there's a big difference between keeping an animal alive versus making sure that an animal has a good quality of life. The latter was never really considered in this process. So what has happened is that there's a lot of focus on making sure that an animal eats, breeds, and doesn't get sick, right? So anything about like the psychology of the animal, or making sure the animal is happy and can engage in all natural behaviors, that was never a consideration. And that's how we ended up today with these very minimalistic barren tanks where these animals are being kept in, and that is being promoted by the industry because that's normalized now, and that's something that we're trying to undo in our work. A couple of examples here of normalized, we call folklore husbandry principles, that animals don't move, that they're just like lying around all day. Well, this is not true. Animals in the wild, they need to eat, they need to mate, they need to migrate a lot of the times. So they're very busy, they have stuff to do. But by enclosing them in a small tank, or even like, you know, it's that opportunity is taken away from them. Another big one is snakes don't need to stretch their bodies, which again is folklore husbandry. A lot of snakes are still being kept in containers where they aren't able to stretch their bodies, despite the fact that science has shown that snakes will and need to stretch their bodies for comfort, for thermal regulations, and for other things. And the last thing to point out is like the abnormal behaviors as well, right? You might know if you go to a zoo and you see an animal pacing, like going back and forth along the fence line, that's an abnormal behavior, something you wouldn't see in the wild. while other smaller animals like birds and reptiles and amphibians, they can engage in those abnormal behaviors as well. So one of them is snakes and other reptiles. You might see them trying to, they touch the tank, the glass of the tank. And this is because reptiles, they haven't evolved, but they don't recognize transparent boundaries like glass. So they don't understand that concept, and they will try to continue to go through the glass because they're enclosed and they're like, well, I don't understand this. I should be able to go through it. And this might end up hurting an animal pretty badly. They can have nostril lesions, or on their paws and claws, they might get damaged. And these are things pet owners or the industry might say like, oh, they're just curious. They're trying to like explore their environment. But science has shown it's an abnormal behavior, and these animals shouldn't be kept in these conditions because they can be harmful. Next slide, please. So what does science tells us? And that's something I kind of mentioned before, but here are a couple of things. I really enjoy these things because like every year they find out new stuff. And in my mind, I'm like, well, of course reptiles can do this, or of course amphibians can do this. But just a couple of things that I think are really interesting is that, science has shown that reptiles can feel positive and negative emotional states. So that means they can be happy, they can be excited, but they can also suffer and feel pain, for example. Reptiles can solve problems just like dogs. You can train them to use buttons like, they've done with monkeys. They have long-lasting memories, so they can solve puzzles, and then 3 months later you will give the same puzzle and they remember it, especially with turtles and tortoises. So it's really, if you see, they can do a lot of things that we know animals like dogs and cats can do, which is really cool to see. And then for the amphibians, one thing I think is kind of neat that has been discovered is that the pain receptors release similar compounds or similar substances that you will see in mammals. So that's one of the reasons now that we know amphibians do feel pain, and they do, they need bigger consideration how we treat these animals. And also amphibians in captivity can benefit from enrichment. So that means they can play, they have play behavior, they engage in social behaviors, all these things that we thought these animals weren't able to do. Little by little, science is showing that they're capable of a lot more. And these are the more and more reasons are being discovered why these animals shouldn't be kept in captivity, and we should protect them in the wild where they should live their lives. And that's it for me, I believe. So I'll hand it back over to Liz.
Thanks, Michelle. Next slide, please. So after you've learned some about why we're fighting to protect these wild animals who are being exploited by the pet industry, we're going to give you some possible action items. So one thing that's coming up is on October 21st, which is next week, we are asking advocates to pressure PetSmart to phase out animal sales, starting with the sale of reptiles and amphibians by delivering a campaign packet to their local PetSmart store or multiple stores. And Mackenzie is going to drop the link in the chat. If you sign up to drop off a packet, you will be asked to basically just take the packet to the store, but you'll receive instructions, talking points about the campaign, and a sign to take a photo. So as I said, you can just take the packet to the store and ask employees to pass the information on to upper management, or if you're willing and able, you can attempt to get into a bit of a conversation with the employee, maybe ask their thoughts about the campaign. And then we'd really love for people to use our photo sign, or you can make a sign at home. It just says, tell PetSmart to stop selling animals. Take a photo of yourself with the sign in front of PetSmart or with your companion animal, or anywhere really if you'd like. There's not many rules when it comes to campaigns like this. And then we're asking people to either post on social media or to send us your photo. And if you post on social media, we're asking people to use the hashtag anything for pets so we can amplify the campaign online. And the reason we're using the anything for pets hashtag is because that is PetSmart's main hashtag. And our goal is to disrupt their business, make them notice us, and make the biggest impact for animals possible. And I know I just said that really quickly. If anything was confusing, don't worry. The packet you'd receive in the mail explains things really clearly. And we're also going to give you an email address so you can follow up if you have any questions. Next slide, please. Here are a few tips. If you can't deliver a packet on the 21st, that's a Friday, that's not a big deal at all. Feel free to deliver it in the days before or after the 21st, whatever works for your schedule. Next, if you're nervous about talking to an employee, you can either use our talking points to help guide the conversation or just drop the packet off. You can just say, you know, I'm here to drop off a packet. I'd love for you to pass this information on to upper management because I'm really concerned about the sale of animals in your store. You don't have to try to have a long conversation if that's not your style. Finally, of course, we want everyone to always be polite and respectful. This campaign is not about harassing people working in the stores. It's about reaching the executives. And it's important to know, if you didn't realize, that the people working in the stores have, you know, they're not the ones setting these policies. And many of them are there because they care about animals. So we always want to be polite and respectful in all our communications. Next slide, please. In addition to the October 21st action, we have a couple other resources that I want to highlight today that you can use to help wild animals. The first is our children's activity book, which you can see on the left, and also, there's the link in the chat if you want to download it. It's a really sweet book filled with coloring pages, mazes, and other games for younger children on the topic of why wild animals belong in the wild and not in human homes. You can download and print as many copies as you want for free. And we also have a limited number of printed copies for educators. So if you're an educator or you work in any sort of situation with a group of people who might be interested in using this, please send an email to usprograms@worldanimalprotection.us to ask about having copies mailed to you. We also have a Spanish version of the activity book available, which you can download at the next link in the chat. Second, on the right, we have a toolkit to help people work with their local legislators to pass ordinances banning the retail sale of animals. So this means that pet stores wouldn't be allowed to sell animals or certain species of animals. These laws are similar to puppy mill ordinances that you might be familiar with. There are now, I think, more than 300 puppy mill ordinances in the United States, and 5 states, including California, Illinois, and Maryland. The entire state has banned cat and dog sales. But of course, while these laws are really wonderful, they left so many other species behind. So we're really working to push municipalities to expand that circle of compassion to all species. And if you download the toolkit, of course, it's for free. It breaks down both the steps of why laws like these are so important, gives you a bit of a beginner's guide to local legislation and how to work with local legislators. And it also has model ordinance language, which is taken from the Cambridge, Massachusetts ordinance, which is really the only ordinance in the country right now that really bans all these retail sales. Again, if you have any questions about the toolkit, or you are excited about using it in your own community and just want to touch base, you can again send an email to usprograms@worldanimalprotection.us. I'm going to pass it back to Cameron for questions.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thank you, Michelle. Just a lot of great information we just heard from our presenters. I'm going to ask Liz and Michelle to turn their cameras on. Yep, thank you. So now we have a chance to follow up with both speakers with any questions that you may have. As a reminder, feel free to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screens to drop a question in. You can also drop them into the chat. We'll be keeping our eyes over there as well. So feel free to pass along any questions that have come up. First and foremost, Liz, following up on what you just presented on about the National Reptile Awareness Day and the actions there. Are there other ways to participate in this upcoming action other than delivering a packet to the store?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Cameron. So we understand that in-person advocacy isn't a good fit for everyone, or some people might want to do something a little less demanding at first. So we also have a number of digital actions, and I neglected to get that link ready, of course, but I will drop it in the chat or send it to Mackenzie shortly. But in addition to this in-person advocacy, it always makes a big difference to reach out directly to the corporation or pressure them on social media. And World Animal Protection and many other groups, we offer these great, like click to action. So you get an email and you just click on it, and then email is automatically sent to the corporation with sort of a canned message. And those are a really powerful tool. But it's really great to diversify your actions with things like that, with more personalized actions, because it really makes a corporation sit up and take notice. So we have options like writing a personal email to a corporation, or writing a personal tweet, or not a personal tweet, but writing your own tweet and tweeting it on social media. So I will find that link and put it in the chat.
Thanks, Liz. And it's just a quick follow-up to that. So that action is really targeting PetSmart, but are you targeting Petco as well, or just focused on PetSmart at this time?
So in July, we also expanded our campaign to include Petco. So National Reptile Awareness Day this year, which is October 21st, is focused on PetSmart, because we wanted to maximize our impact by focusing on one company. But we do have this concurrent campaign going against Petco. And we'll be doing a tweet action later this month, or I think next week. And also in 2023, we'll definitely have more actions focused on Petco.
That's great. Thanks so much, Liz. A bit of a broader kind of issue question that perhaps, Michelle, you could answer. How many animals are there trapped up and suffering in the wildlife trade, and are things getting worse or better?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot. The international wildlife trade really affects billions of animals. One thing that I might forgot to mention is wild animals are wild regardless if they're kept or bred in captivity or captured from the wild. So when you look at animals being captured from the wild and add the number of animals being bred in captivity, not only for pets, right, also for fur, for food, for other reasons, it really impacts billions of animals. And it's one of the biggest threats to the survival of wild population around the world, including in North America. In the pet trade itself, there are about, I think, a little over 1,000 individual species that are being impacted, and that ranges anywhere from mammals to amphibians and fish. Obviously, we often forget fish, but fish is a huge part of wild animals being traded for pets.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And you mentioned that this is an issue that impacts millions, if not billions, of animals. So perhaps Liz or either of you could answer this question. For the animals that are caught up in the trade already, are we able to return them to the wild? What happens to animals who maybe can't be returned to the wild because of their experience so far, or because they've been bred in mills?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I'll start, and then I think Michelle can have things to add. When we're talking about the wildlife trade, generally, that's a huge number of animals. So for a lion who was rescued from the wildlife trade, the answer is going to be different for perhaps a turtle who has been rescued from the wildlife trade, who's coming from a PetSmart store. So at World Animal Protection, we're fighting for a world where every wild animal is living free in their wild home. But we acknowledge the reality that many animals right now are caught up in this trade. So we are working to collaborate and support the work of accredited sanctuaries and rescues. Last year, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we had a webinar with two great panelists, one from the Washington, D.C. animal shelter, talking about their struggles, but also their great work with these animals like red-eared sliders who are sold at PetSmart. And their struggles to rehome them. And also foster parrots, which is a global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries accredited sanctuary doing a lot of work on birds, but also they have reptiles and amphibians. So we again, ultimately, we want to see every wild animal in the wild, but we acknowledge, and there are these good places for animals in the meantime for them to go, though of course their space is limited. And then of course, we acknowledge that there are people who adopt or are adopting these animals from shelters who are trying to doing the right thing and provide a habitat that's as similar to the wild as possible. Michelle?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. I think it's just very important that, you know, in addition that we need better regulations and we need bans and other regulations to curb this trade and end this trade eventually. In the meantime, it's very important that the public gets educated, that people in government are educated, and even people within the pet industry are getting educated about this issue. And that it needs to go hand in hand. So and we need to have places for these animals to go when people want to dispose of them, which is one of the reasons, frankly, these animals shouldn't be kept, because there is no plan B for many of these animals, right? The infrastructures that shelters have is usually set up for cats and dogs, not so much for these animals, because they're very complicated and complex to keep. So it's a multi-pronged approach, I think, that needs to drive down the demand. That needs to, companies like PetSmart and Petco need to end the sale of these animals. These animals need to disappear from our view, from the internet. And then eventually we'll have places where the animals that remain can go to and live out their lives accordingly. And just one quick thing I wanted to add as well. If you're a PetSmart customer on the day of action, make sure to mention that, right? For companies, it's really important that their customers, they listen to their customers. You really have an impact where you put your money. And as a customer if you're a customer of one of these stores, make sure to mention that, because the more people who speak out against these practices, the more it will be prioritized within those companies, and we can achieve change together. That was just something I wanted to put in there. Back to you, Cameron.
Thanks, Michelle. You mentioned the multi-pronged approach, and of course at World Animal Protection we have the multi-country approach as well. So I think a final question over for you, Michelle, is, Liz talked about some of the activities we have in this campaign for the US. So just wondering if you could speak to what activities you have planned in Canada on this issue.
Yeah, so we're also doing something on Reptile Awareness Day. It's a little smaller approach. Last year, we used the day to hand over our petition, and we went to some stores to talk to some employees. This year, we are focusing on PetSmart customers, and we are going to try to catch some PetSmart customers outside of the store by handing out information why PetSmart should be stopping the sales of reptiles and amphibians to begin with. Again, we think that customers can have a huge impact on decision-making within PetSmart. Petco doesn't exist in the same capacity, so it's not a target for us yet. They have gone into the Canadian market, but not with live animal sales, so our focus will be only on PetSmart. And after that, we'll continue with outreach, and we'll continue activating our supporters to put pressure on these companies to end this practice.
Great. Thanks so much. I think that's a great note to end on, and really just appreciate everyone who's joined us today for giving us your time and your attention. Please feel free to reach out to us, and please do consider participating in one of the actions that we have mentioned to help wild animals that are sold as pets, including participating in our action against PetSmart for National Reptile Awareness Day, whether that's in the US if you're based here, or in Canada if you are based there. Sending an email to PetSmart and Petco executives asking them to end the sale of wild animals at their stores, or becoming a supporter of World Animal Protection by using the QR code on their screen or the link in the chat as well. So again, we really just appreciate you giving us so much for your time in the middle of your days, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thanks so much.